Okay, so far we've been talking about these questions in moral psychology. So we've been talking about the question, how is it that people make moral judgments? Do they make moral judgments based on emotion or reason? Is it a capacity that's just learned, or is it something that's innate? But now, in this last talk, I thought I'd take things in a slightly broader direction. So what I ask about is a slightly different question. I want to ask about the role of people's moral thinking in their cognition as a whole. So what is the role of this particular type of thinking about morality, in the role in our entire cognition, in just the way we think about things in general? So suppose we look out at a certain particular kind of situation unfolding. And as we look at this situation, we might make certain kinds of moral judgments about it. We might think that the person in this situation is doing something morally wrong or morally right. We might think that the person deserves praise or blame for what the person is doing. But we might also think about all sorts of other aspects of the situation. We might look out at the situation and just wonder, what are these people doing? Or we might wonder, what do they intend to accomplish? Or we might wonder, are these people happy or unhappy? What are they going to be causing down the line, and so forth? So the question now arises, what is really the relationship between these two aspects of people's thought? The way they think about moral questions, like say, whether someone did something morally wrong or morally right, and then the way they think about these like straightforwardly factual questions. Questions just like, what are these people doing? What are they intending to accomplish? What are they going to be causing, and so forth? What is the relation between these two kinds of judgments? And here, there's been a kind of traditional picture that I think really long dominated the field. The picture was that we can think about the relationship between these two things in terms of something like a series of stages. So you look out on the situation, and the first thing you do is you just try to figure out what is actually going on in this situation. So you just try to think, what are these people doing? What are they intending? What are they causing? You just try to get a grip in a purely factual, broadly scientific way on what's occurring in this situation. And then, once you figure that out, once you really know what's happening in the situation, then you can do something further. There's a kind of second stage. In the second stage, you take in all this information about what these people are doing, and you use it to make a further judgment, a moral judgment about, say, whether what they're doing is morally right or morally wrong. So in this kind of view, moral cognition occupies just this kind of small and very delimited aspect of our cognition as a whole. When we try and understand the world, most of what we're doing has nothing to do with morality. It's just this purely scientific attempt to understand things. And then there's this kind of extra little step at the end. After all this rest of things is done, this extra little step where we engage in moral cognition, try to make a moral judgment. So in this view, morality doesn't end up being that important, but it is playing a certain role in one aspect of the process. And I think this kind of view is somehow deeply intuitive on a certain level. There's something that really resonates with people about this kind of picture. For that reason, it's long held a sort of grip on the whole way that study of moral cognition worked. But just in the past few years, there's been a kind of growing challenge to this view. I think this challenge has really come from a kind of surprising source. So it happened that a group of people who are actually in philosophy departments began thinking the right way of going about understanding concepts would be to actually do experimental studies about how people use these concepts. So these were philosophers just trying to understand the concept of knowledge, the concept of causation, what is the concept of intention, and so forth. And they began thinking, if we really want to understand how these concepts work, maybe we can't just sort of sit here in our armchairs and try to figure it out by reflecting on it. Maybe we should go out and actually do experiments to see how people use these concepts. So we're going to do studies which we systematically vary particular factors and then show how varying those factors will influence people's application of these ordinary concepts. So this ended up being really a kind of revolutionary move within philosophy. It led to this sort of new and different approach of engaging in philosophical inquiry. So just as a number of years ago, there was a time in which economists first began doing economic experiments and thus gave birth to this field of experimental economics, so too now there's been this kind of real shift toward this new idea of what's called experimental philosophy. But I think what's really exciting about this new work is not so much just the very idea of philosophers doing experiments, but rather the particular things that these people ended up showing. Because when these people went out and started doing these experimental studies, they didn't end up finding results that conformed to that kind of traditional picture. They didn't find that there was a kind of initial stage in which people just figured out on a factual level what was going on in a situation, followed by a subsequent stage in which they used that information in order to make a moral judgment. Rather, they really seem to be finding exactly the opposite. What they seem to be finding is that people's moral judgments were sort of influencing the process from the very beginning, so that people's whole way of making sense of the world seemed to be really suffused through and through with this kind of moral considerations or this moral perspective. So in this sense, our ordinary way of making sense of the world really seems to look very, very deeply different from a kind of scientific perspective on the world. It seems to be evaluated in this really fundamental sense. So I thought what I'd do today is just talk about a couple of examples in which this sort of effect seems to be arising, and then get your input about how we might be able to understand it. So the very first experiment I'm going to be describing is one that I think a lot of you already know, but then after that I'm going to be talking about newer work that I think most of you won't already be familiar with. So the very first effect I want to mention is an effect on people's ordinary intuitions about intentional action. So the concept of intentional action. This is the concept we use to distinguish between things that people do intentionally, like say, taking a sip of wine, and things that people do unintentionally, like say, spilling the wine all over one's own shirt. So the question now is, how does this distinction work? How do people ordinarily distinguish between things that are done intentionally and those that are done unintentionally? And I think when you first begin to consider this, there's a sort of view that seems really tempting. And this view is, this distinction is just a straightforward, factual distinction. It just has to do with the mental states of the person performing the action. So what it is to do something intentionally is something like to know that you're doing this thing, or perhaps to want to do this thing. If you know that you're doing it, or you want to do it, or maybe something like that, well, then you did it intentionally. But we started thinking, maybe there's actually more to this case. Maybe there was something more subtle going on in people's intuitions about intentional action. And in fact, maybe people's moral judgments were actually playing a role in their notion of what it is to do something intentionally or unintentionally. So the thought then was, if you want to know whether someone did something intentionally or unintentionally, it's not enough just to know what they wanted or what they knew. You have to make a judgment about whether what they're doing is something morally bad or something morally good. So to get at this initially, we just ran a very simple study in which participants were assigned to one of two conditions. So there were two different conditions, subjects were randomly assigned to them. They differ in just one respect. Participants in one condition got the following story. The story went like this. The vice president of a company goes to the chairman of the board, and he says, okay, we've got this new policy. It's going to make huge amounts of money for our company, but it's also going to harm the environment. And the chairman of the board says, look, I know this policy is going to harm the environment, but I don't care at all about that. All I care about is just making as much money as we possibly can. So let's go ahead and implement the policy. So they implement the policy, and then sure enough, it ends up harming the environment. And the question then was, did the chairman of the board harm the environment intentionally? And faced with this question, most people say yes. They say the chairman of the board harmed the environment intentionally. And when you first start thinking about why they might say yes to a question like this, it seems like it probably just has something to do with the mental states that this chairman is described as having. So the chairman knows that he's going to harm the environment. He goes ahead and does it anyway. Maybe it's that fact, the fact that he had this particular mental state, that makes people think he did it intentionally. But we were thinking, maybe there's actually something more complex involved. Maybe part of the reason that people say he did it intentionally is not just his knowledge or the mental state he had, but the fact that they make this particular moral judgment, the fact that they judge that harming the environment is something morally bad or morally wrong for him to do. So participants in the other condition got a case that was almost exactly the same, except for one difference. Just the word harm was changed to help. So the story then becomes this. The vice president of a company goes to the chairman of the board and says, okay, we've got this new policy. It's going to make huge amounts of money for our company, and it's also going to help the environment. And the chairman of the board says, look, I know this policy is going to help the environment, but I don't care at all about that. All I care about is just making as much money as we possibly can. So let's go ahead and implement the policy. So you implement the policy, sure enough, it helps the environment. And now the question is, did the chairman help the environment intentionally? But here, people don't give the same response. They don't say that the chairman helped the environment intentionally. Instead, they tend to say that the chairman helped the environment unintentionally. But look at what's happening in these two cases. In the two cases, it seems like the chairman's attitude is exactly the same. In both cases, he knows the outcome is going to occur. He decides to do it anyway, but he doesn't care about it at all. He's not trying to make it happen. The thing that's differing between the two cases is just somehow the moral status of what the person is doing. That in one case, he's doing something bad, harming the environment. In the other case, he's doing something good, helping the environment. So it seems somehow that people's moral judgments can affect their intuitions just about whether he did it intentionally or unintentionally. So when we first came out with these results a number of years ago, it was really puzzling why this might be happening. We really couldn't understand what might be going on here, what might be the sort of boundaries or the nature of this effect. But just in the past couple of years, a whole bunch of different studies by different researchers are really giving us a lot of insight into why this effect is occurring, what might really be going on here. So I thought that a good way of discussing some of this work would be to talk about the work on this effect that's been done by the people here, the people at this workshop. And maybe that would also just give a sort of general sense of how work on this topic has been proceeding. So I thought I'd start by talking about a study that was done in Mark Hauser's lab. So Mark Hauser was interested in the question, is this effect, the effect that we just described, due to people's emotional responses? is it something about the way we're emotionally responding in these cases that leads us to say that the harming is something bad and the helping is something good? That the harming is intentional and the helping is unintentional. So researchers in his lab came up with a really interesting way of going about this phenomenon, testing this question. And that was to look at people who have really serious deficits in the capacity for emotional response. So if we want to know why ordinary people respond in the way they do, whether the ordinary people's responses is due to this sort of emotional reaction they have, we can go to people who differ from us in the relevant respect, who have a real impairment in the capacity for emotional response, and then see how they respond. So Hauser and Hauser's lab looked at the intuitions of people who have lesions to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So as a number of people at this workshop so far have mentioned, people who have these lesions, BMPFC lesions, show really, really severe impairments in the capacity for emotional response. Their capacity to respond emotionally is really different from the way that normal subjects would. And on moral questions that have been claimed to involve emotion, they give really, really different responses. So a team of researchers led by this pretty amazing graduate student named Lian Yang just went to these participants with lesions to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and gave them that exact case that I just described. The case of the guy who either harms the environment or helps the environment. And the result really came as something of a surprise. These participants showed exactly the same asymmetry we find among normal participants. So even these people with really serious impairments in the capacity for emotional response, they still said he harmed the environment intentionally, but he helped the environment unintentionally. So what Lian Yang, Mark Hauser, and their colleagues then concluded is that maybe this effect actually has nothing to do with emotion. Maybe it's not due to an emotional response that they're having. Maybe we really have a kind of purely cognitive system for a kind of non-conscious moral appraisal, and it's that purely cognitive, non-conscious appraisal that's driving the effect we find in normals. So we have this emotional response to these cases, but if you take that emotional response away from us, we still show the same answer. So it must not have been the emotional response that was driving our answers in the first place. But of course, in cases like these, we often find different experimental studies that push in different kinds of directions. In this case is no exception. So it happens that David Pizarro and Paul Bloom also ran a series of studies on this topic, but their studies ended up moving in a really different direction. They were thinking maybe people's emotional responses do have an impact on these judgments. And in particular, they were thinking maybe people's emotional responses can have an impact even in cases where they don't endorse those emotional responses. So suppose you look at a situation, you see someone doing something, and you find that what this person is doing really disgusting, it disquiets you or disturbs you, you feel sort of bad about it. But then suppose you reflect, you reason about the situation, and you conclude what this person is doing is not actually bad, it's not wrong at all. So what you think ultimately is that there was no reason to be disgusted by it. Your disgust is misplaced, this is actually a perfectly fine action. Their suggestion was that in a case like that, you'd find the effect emerging anyway. The immediate kind of emotional response people have would still impact their judgments about whether the person acted intentionally, even in cases where they didn't endorse that sort of emotion. So what they needed then is a case in which people would have immediate emotional response that they wouldn't end up endorsing. So how do you find such a case? Well, one of the cases they came up with was the case of interracial sex. So they began by just asking participants straight out, what do you think of interracial sex? Is there anything wrong with interracial sex? And you'll be happy to know 100% of subjects say, absolutely not. There is nothing wrong with interracial sex. It's completely fine. But then they had a kind of trickier way of getting at people's intuitions about this question. And the way was this, by presenting a case that was much like the one that I described earlier with the chairman. So subjects were told, imagine there's an executive at a record company, and he's meeting with his assistant, and his assistant says, okay, we've got this new music video. We know it's really going to increase sales of this album, but we've been looking at the images in this video, and we think it's also going to encourage interracial sex. So in particular, it's going to encourage sex between black men and white women. And the record executive thinks about it for a moment, and then he says, look, I know that these images in this video are going to encourage interracial sex, but I don't care at all about that. All I care about is just increasing sales of this album. So let's go ahead with this new video. We're going to release it. And then they release the new video, and sure enough, it ends up encouraging interracial sex. And now the question is, did he encourage interracial sex intentionally? What you see here is a really striking kind of correlation. Those participants who are high in just a dispositional tendency to feel the emotion of disgust, those participants who just in general, about various events that might occur to them in their lives, feel higher levels of this emotion of disgust tend to say that he intentionally encouraged interracial sex. Whereas those participants who are low in this dispositional tendency to feel disgust, they say that he unintentionally encouraged interracial sex. So what we see here is this kind of striking finding. Even though all of these participants claim, they swear that they find nothing wrong with interracial sex, those who have the higher levels of disgust, maybe they have a kind of immediate emotional reaction to this case that they then choose not to endorse. But that immediate emotional reaction is still impacting their intuitions about whether it's done intentionally or unintentionally. So I think looking at these different kinds of data, it's very difficult to figure out what to make of them. Maybe further studies can be done that can help disentangle these kinds of effects. But instead of disentangling them right now, let's turn to a completely separate example. So in a completely separate kind of case in which a similar sort of effect arises. And this is the concept of happiness. So the concept of happiness is the concept we use when we ask, is this person truly happy? Or if we asked, has this person really achieved happiness? And the question now arises, what is that concept? What is our concept of happiness? And initially, you might think exactly the same thing that people thought about intentional action. The concept of happiness is just the concept of having a certain kind of mental state. So to have happiness is to have these emotions like feelings of pleasure, enjoyment in the things that you're doing, a sense of satisfaction. If you have those mental states, then you're happy. If not, then you're not happy. It's just this purely scientific kind of thing. But then, as we started thinking about it, we started thinking, maybe there's something actually more to it. Maybe when you pick out a person, you ask, is this person truly happy? You're not just asking, does this person have this psychological state? You're asking something more, something that involves a certain kind of value judgment. You're asking, does this person have a life that has a certain kind of value or meaning in some way? So if you ask, if you say, I hope that this child will grow up to be happy, you're not just saying, I hope this child will grow up to have a certain psychological state. You're saying, I hope this child will grow up and have a certain kind of life, a life about which you could make a certain kind of value judgment. So if that's right, then the concept of happiness is really different from other kinds of concepts that we use to understand the emotions. In particular, it would even be different from the concept of unhappiness. So before I talk about any of the data, let me just see if you can kind of get this picture intuitively. So suppose we're talking about someone and I say, is she truly happy? The intuition you're supposed to have is that when I ask that question, I'm not just asking, does she have a certain psychological state, or does she feel certain emotions? Is she feeling this kind of pleasure? You seem to be getting at something more. When you say she's truly happy, you're saying that her life has some kind of meaning or value. But now consider the opposite question. Suppose we're talking about someone and I say, she's truly unhappy. In saying she's truly unhappy, I'm not saying that her life actually is bad or empty or meaningless. It seems like I'm just saying that she has a particular kind of emotion, that she has a particular kind of feeling, this feeling of unhappiness. So what we're thinking is that these concepts might differ in this sort of systematic way. So before I talk about this difference between happiness and unhappiness, maybe I'll just give you a feeling for the kind of effect you see just within the case of happiness. And this is a study that's definitely unpublished. We just submitted it a couple weeks ago. In these studies, we just asked people questions. We presented people with vignettes that differed in certain respects. Just asked whether the person is happy. So subjects in the first case got the following condition. Maria is the mother of 3 children who all really love her. In fact, they couldn't imagine having a better mom. Maria usually stays pretty busy taking care of her children. She often finds herself rushing from one birthday party to the next and is always going to pick up some groceries or buy school supplies. While Maria has been preoccupied with her children, she does get to see her old friends occasionally. Almost every night, she ends up working on some project for the next day or planning something for her children's future. So here, participants are given this story about a really meaningful life that has this really wholesome objective, and then participants are told that the person who has this life has these really positive emotional states. So these participants are told, day to day, Maria usually feels excited and really enjoys whatever she's doing. When she reflects on her life, she also feels great. She can't think of anything else in the world that she'd want to spend her time doing, and feels like the success she's had is definitely worth whatever sacrifices she's made. And these participants were just asked a simple question. Is Maria happy? Then participants in the other condition, just as in the story of the chairman who helps or harms the environment, got a story of someone who has a very different kind of life, different from a sort of value-laden perspective, a person whose life is sort of vapid or meaningless or empty in a certain respect. So here's the story that the participants in the other condition got. Maria wants to live the life of a celebrity in LA. In fact, she's even started trying to date a few famous people. Maria usually stays pretty busy trying to become popular. She often finds herself rushing from one party to the next, and is always going to pick up some alcohol or a dress. Maria is so preoccupied with becoming popular that she's no longer concerned with being honest to her old friends unless they know someone famous. Almost every night she ends up either drunk or doing some kind of drug, just like the famous people she wants to be like. But then participants in the second condition were then given the information that she has really positive emotional states. In fact, they were given exactly the same paragraph as participants in the first condition. Day to day, Maria usually feels excited and really enjoys whatever she's doing. When she reflects on her life, she also feels great. She just can't think of anything else in the world that she would want to spend her time doing, and feels like the success she's had is definitely worth whatever sacrifices she has made. And these participants were then given the same question: is Maria happy? So notice, participants in the two conditions are given exactly the same information about what's going on in Maria's head. She has all these kind of positive emotions, feels all this pleasure, takes a lot of enjoyment in her life, but they're given really different information about whether her life is kind of a valuable or meaningful one. And it turns out that they make correspondingly really different judgments for whether she's happy. Even though she experiences positive emotions in both cases, people say that she is happy when her life is a meaningful or valuable one, but that she's not happy in the case where it's not. So we ran a number of different studies on trying to test for this, controlling for various variables, and we always find the same effect emerging. If people believe that Maria is having a sort of vapid or empty or meaningless life, they're unwilling to say that she is happy. But of course, the real claim that I wanted to make was not just about this one concept, about the concept of happiness, but about the idea that this concept differs from other concepts, that the concept of happiness is different from other kinds of emotion concepts in a particular way. So to get at this notion, we ran a separate series of studies that used a 2x2 table. So we have a 2x2 design, which we're independently manipulating two different factors. So first of all, we have a case in which someone has a valuable life, like say being a mother, or a case in which someone has this non-valuable or bad life, like say being this Paris Hilton kind of character. Then separately from that, we have this other difference between different conditions. Some participants are just asked the question, is Maria happy? And then other participants are asked the question, is Maria unhappy? So if you look at the judgments about whether Maria is happy, they just replicate the existing finding. So people say that Maria is happy if she has a good life, but they do not say that Maria is happy if she has a bad life. But now suppose you just turn to this other question. You just ask subjects, is she unhappy? There you see absolutely no effect. There's no effect of people's moral judgments on whether people say that Maria is unhappy. The only thing that affects whether they say that she is unhappy or not is just what mental state she's described as having. Is she described as feeling bad, or is she described as feeling good? So across 3 different studies, we find the same interaction pattern arising. For judgments about the question, is she happy? The moral status of her life is playing a really big role. For judgments about the question, is she unhappy? There's no effect of moral judgment. Oh, so now I have to pause to see what to... So in conclusion, I just want to say a few brief words about where all of this seems to be heading. So when we first started out doing this kind of research, it seemed like maybe the effect we were seeing for this concept of intentional action was just some weird kind of quirk or idiosyncrasy, something kind of bizarre about this one concept. And that there was something special going on about this concept, the concept of intentional action, but that kind of traditional picture I started out by describing might still be right. But as research on these kind of phenomena has proceeded, we seem to be finding this same kind of effect again and again for every single concept that we're looking at. So it's not just that moral judgments impact people's intuitions about intentional action. It's not just the impact intuitions about happiness. They also impact intuitions about knowledge, about causation, about freedom, even about whether a particular trait counts as being innate. So what it's really starting to look like now is that this initial effect we see, say, for the concept of intentional action, was really just a symptom of some much broader phenomenon, whereby people's moral judgments just really seem to be infecting their whole way of understanding the world they see around them. So I'd be really interested in hearing what folks here think about how this phenomenon might be explained. Thanks.